This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. I heard someone say the other day they felt patriotism was making a comeback. It is most regrettable to think patriotism has ever reached a point where it must make a comeback. I do know of one place where patriotism has always flourished. I'm thinking now of the National Guard. I'm thinking of times when the National Guard has made airdrops of food during a blizzard to help save a cattleman's livestock. I'm thinking of times the National Guard has helped to save lives in flooded areas. I'm thinking of the Air National Guard units that were called in just a matter of days for duty in Vietnam. Patriotism, I am happy to say it is indeed alive and living in the National Guard. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. I would like to read some stirring words spoken by a truly great American, Dwight D. Eisenhower. I read, "Americans, indeed all free men, remember that in the final choice, a soldier's pack is not so heavy a burden as a prisoner's chain." Now, who today is carrying that soldier's pack? Well, for one, National Guardsmen. They are carrying the soldier's pack during intensive weekly training periods in their communities. They are carrying it in the jungles of Vietnam. And National Guardsmen are ready to carry the soldier's pack anywhere in the world, anytime our country asks them. So that in the words of Dwight Eisenhower, we may not have to carry the prisoner's chain. Think of that when you see National Guardsmen training in your community. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. I want to speak for a minute about the special wars fought by the National Guard. And I don't mean the wars fought on battlefields throughout our country's history. I mean the wars the National Guard fights against nature. I'm talking about the wars National Guardsmen waged against floods, against forest fires, against blizzards, against tornadoes. In all of these wars against natural disasters, Guardsmen prevent panic. They save property, and above all, they save lives, countless lives. The National Guard has won thousands of medals for gallantry on the bullet-ridden battlefield. But I've often thought it's too bad we don't give the National Guard medals for serving humanity. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. What picture comes to mind when I say the words American Patriot? Maybe you picture Patrick Henry shouting, "Give me liberty," or "Give me death." Maybe you picture the Minuteman at Concord with powder horn and musket. But do any of you picture the modern American soldier, a soldier like today's National Guardsman? The National Guardsman is a true patriot, ready to rush to the aid of our country whenever he is needed. In recent times, for example, Guardsmen have answered the call to action during the Berlin crisis and the Vietnam War. The American Patriot is an old historic concept, but the American Patriot is alive today in the person of the National Guardsman, and I, for one, am thankful for it. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. Someone recently said patriotism is making a comeback. I know where it has never had to make a comeback. That's in the National Guard. Think how Guardsmen rush to aid communities in distress, how they always answer our country's call, as in the Berlin crisis and Vietnam. Patriotism, I'm happy to say, is indeed alive and living in the National Guard. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. Dwight Eisenhower once said, "A soldier's pack is not so heavy a burden as a prisoner's chain." Who is carrying that pack? For one, National Guardsmen. They are carrying the soldier's pack during intensive drills at home and also in the jungles of Vietnam. Why? So we may not have to carry the prisoner's chain. Think of that when you see guardsmen training in your community. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. The National Guard not only fights wars on the battlefield, it also fights wars against natural disasters. Guardsmen battle floods, blizzards, and tornadoes, working to save property and lives. The Guard has won many medals for action on the battlefield, but I've often thought it's too bad we don't give the National Guard medals for serving humanity. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. When I say American patriot, who do you think of? Patrick Henry? How about today's National Guardsman? He is a patriot, serving our country whenever we need him, as he did in the Berlin crisis and now in Vietnam. The American patriot is alive today in the person of the National Guardsman, and I, for one, am thankful for it. This is Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. Coming from the land of Lincoln in Illinois, could it be otherwise when I think of patriotism than to think of Abraham Lincoln? For he was indeed a patriot. I need not allude to his wartime record in the Black Hawk War, but rather to his fidelity and his devotion to the Declaration of Independence, to the Constitution of the United States, and to the laws of the land. Didn't he say in Philadelphia that rather than forswear the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, he would rather be assassinated on the spot? That is fidelity indeed to the very basis of this country and the free principles that it has undertaken to make available at all times to every one of its citizens. Those are the things we try to protect. And while we do so, we try also to protect them so far as other people are concerned. For freedom is one of those fabrics that is indivisible. You lacerate it at one point and there is the danger that it will be destroyed all over. That's why we take ourselves to the corners of the earth so often, to stand in the corner with weak and defenseless people, that their freedom and their right of self-determination might also be preserved. And so, thinking of patriotism, thinking of Abraham Lincoln, the great patriot, I think also of those who are committed to the security and the defense of this country, and who do so without complaint or protest. And not the least among them, as you well know, is the National Guard of the United States of America in every jurisdiction, in every state in this great union.
You want to be a real cornball, a square? Just announce to a group of friends someday that you love your country. Be patriotic in public and watch them cringe. Go a step further and tell them you like what the National Guard stands for. Guardian of your country, defender of democracy. Tell them, I'm an American and proud of it. That and a dime, your best friends will tell you in confidence, will get you a cup of coffee. Patriotism is passé. The Air National Guard pilot who takes a few days off from a job to fly wounded GIs back from Vietnam is a chump. He could be playing golf. The guardsman who helps protect your property in times of civil strife, what's his angle? We think we know his angle. He's a guy who takes a lot of pride in the job he does for his country and community. He's patriotic, a real square. Thank God. What is the National Guard doing in Vietnam? They're fighting. What is the National Guard doing in Maryland? They're looking for a lost child. What is the National Guard doing in Ohio? Helping a community in the aftermath of a flood. What is the National Guard doing in Cuba? Ferrying supplies to our Marines in Guantanamo. What is the National Guard doing in Hawaii? The National Guard is that state's total air defense. What is the National Guard doing? Fighting our country's battles, defending each citizen's rights, helping our communities in times of strife. What can you do for the National Guard? The next time you see a guardsman, say thanks. That's all. Take 4 tanks of deadly chlorine gas, put them on a barge, float that barge down the Mississippi River, have it hit a whirlpool, and sink. What do you have? You have what the people of Natchez, Mississippi had in 1961. Nearly 2.5 million pounds of chlorine gas sunk offshore, with the corroded tanks ready to burst open and spew forth green clouds of poison on 80,000 people. What do you do about it? Try to salvage the tanks before they rupture and have the National Guard on hand in case they do. Mississippi Guardsmen quickly helped create a gas warning system and evacuation plan, trained people in quick escape methods, stood ready to prevent panic and save lives. After months of work, the tanks were salvaged. The nightmare was over. Next time someone says, "What good is the National Guard?" tell him 80,000 people would like to have some words with him in Natchez, Mississippi. Ernie Snyder of Frederick, Maryland, was home when he heard the radio report. A boy, 3 years old, missing for 6 hours in a Maryland state forest. Suddenly, Ernie Snyder was in his car. 30 minutes later, he was at the state forest to help police in the search for the boy. Ernie Snyder is a lieutenant in the Army National Guard. He issued a radio call to the men of his unit. Within 2 hours, 48 National Guardsmen were on the scene. The searchers penetrated the forest. No child. Night came. Temperatures fell to near freezing. No child. And then it was dawn and morning. And suddenly, Lieutenant Snyder heard a noise. 300 yards away was little Wesley Ians. Next time someone asks, "What's so great about the National Guard?" tell him, if he really wants to know, to look up a Mr. and Mrs. Claude Ians in Laurel, Maryland. Patriotism, some people say, is for cornballs, for squares. Take the Air National Guard pilot who spends his weekends flying wounded GIs back from Vietnam. He could be home playing golf. What's his angle? We think we know the angle of the National Guardsman. He's a guy who takes pride in the job he does for his country and community. He's patriotic, a real square. Thank God. Who do you call when 4 tanks of chlorine gas sit at the bottom of the Mississippi River, ready to rupture and spew forth poison on 80,000 people? The city of Natchez called the National Guard. Guardsmen helped set up a gas warning system and evacuation plan and stood by to prevent panic and save lives. Next time someone says, "What good is the National Guard?" tell him 80,000 people would like to have some words with him in Natchez, Mississippi. One weekend last summer, Jim Cook of Buffalo, New York, was playing golf with a friend. One weekend later, he was flying a combat mission in Vietnam. Asked how he managed to get combat ready in just a few days after his Air National Guard Tactical Fighter Group was called to active duty, Jim said simply that his unit had never been unready. When the National Guard says that its men are ready to perform their duties on a moment's notice, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Cook, Vietnam, will tell you that they mean exactly what they... As long as there are floods, there will be a National Guard to repair the damage. As long as we have forest fires, there will be a National Guard to fight them. As long as America believes in the rights of people in all nations to remain free, fight freedom's battles. As long as little children wander aimlessly in dark forests, there will be a National Guard to bring them back alive. As long as there is an America, there will be a National Guard answering its calls.